There is a color that has no name. It lives for exactly 3 seconds. It is the precise moment when iron stops being cherry orange and is about to turn blinding white. If you strike the metal 1 second too early, it breaks. If you strike 1 second too late, it melts and runs like spoiled honey. Today, we have laser pyrometers that can measure the temperature of a star. But in 1850, in the Ohio Valley, there were no thermometers. There was only the eye. It's not about looking at the fire, son. It's about letting the fire come into your head. Iron speaks. It screams when it's in pain, and it sings when it's ready. These days, metal is mute. The man you just heard is Elias Thorne, born in 1831, and he was the last man in his valley who knew how to read the fire. What he carried in his hands was not merely calluses. It was an entire library of applied physics, chemistry, and metallurgy, written without a single drop of ink. And then, in a single harvest season, all of that knowledge became useless. This is the story of what we lost when we stopped looking at the fire. To understand Elias's fall, we must understand the height from which he fell. The blacksmith of the mid-19th century was not a hobby. He was the stationary engine of rural civilization. Imagine the weight. Not the metaphorical weight, but the physical. An average blacksmith lifted a 4-kilogram hammer roughly 3,000 times a day. Do the math. That is 12 tons of raw force raised and lowered every day, 6 days a week. You woke up before the sun. The bellows were the lungs of the town. If the bellows stopped, the valley stopped. The horse didn't plow, the wagon didn't move, the barn door didn't open. My shoulders were made of stone, but my hands had to be like velvet for the final tempering. Elias did not work with manuals. The critical temperature of carbon steel, the point where the crystalline structure shifts from ferrite to austenite, occurs at exactly 727 degrees Celsius. Elias did not know what Celsius was. He did not know what austenite was. But he knew that when the shadow of the tongs disappeared against the brightness of the metal, it was time to plunge it into water. The scale of this craft was brutal. There was no pause button. Once the metal left the forge, you had a window of opportunity dictated by thermodynamics. Cooling is relentless. Elias describes the air inside the smithy not as air, but as a thick soup. The smell of burned hoof. That's what nobody tells you. When you shoe a horse, the hot horn rises through your nose and stays there until dinner time. Mix that with coal, old sweat, and ozone. That was the smell of work. If you smelled flowers, you were in the wrong place, or dead. It was an environment hostile to biological life, but it was the only place where inert matter came alive, and to master it, strength alone was not enough. You had to be an obsessive observer. Today, we learn through tutorials. We read, watch, replicate. Elias's learning was tactile, kinesthetic. There were no books in his father's workshop. Knowledge was transferred body to body. The master would hold the apprentice's arm and guide the strike until the rhythm entered the marrow of the bones. My father didn't talk much. If I struck crooked, he'd hit my head with the handle of the tongs. The lesson sank in fast, but the main thing he taught me in silence. He'd say, "Elias, iron has a grain, just like wood. If you strike against the grain, it will betray you when it cools." This understanding of the grain of metal is what we now call molecular alignment. They manipulated the atomic structure of materials based solely on the rebound sensation of the hammer. If the hammer bounced too much, the metal was cold. If it stuck, it was too pasty. It was a dance of instant sensory feedback. And here we enter the territory of mystery, embodied knowledge. There are things that the hands know, but that the conscious mind cannot articulate. Ask a blacksmith from 1850 how he knew when to pull the steel from the water for tempering. He would not say when it reaches 230 degrees. He would say, when the color of wheat straw appears at the edge of the blade. Not just any straw. Morning rain wet straw. Wet straw. That was the technical precision, and it worked. That poetic description corresponded to a temperature window of surgical precision. If he waited for the color to turn dove blue, the tool would be too soft. If he pulled it at lemon yellow, it would shatter like glass. They read the natural world to understand the industrial world. Elias's vocabulary was entirely derived from what he saw in the valley. Blood red, sunset orange, moon white. This meant that to be a good blacksmith, you had to be deeply connected to your environment. You could not calibrate your eye if you had never seen a truly ripe cherry. The secret isn't just the color, it's the light in the smithy. My father never let anyone clean the windows. It had to be dark. If the sun hit the anvil, you'd go blind to the iron. Darkness was our most valuable tool. Darkness as a tool. Think about that. They built their workshops facing north or deliberately coated the windows with soot. Because sunlight washed out the colors of the metal. They needed the contrast. They worked in shadows to bring light to civilization. That knowledge did not stay in the brain. It descended into the tendons. Elias recounts that even while sleeping, his hands would sometimes close into the shape of the hammer handle. You don't think. If you stop to think, now I'll strike, the moment has already passed. The arm knows. It's like walking. You don't think left foot, right foot. You just go. The hammer was the rest of my arm. I felt the metal through the steel of the hammer and the wood of the handle. Neuroscientists call this the extension of the body schema. The brain maps the tool as part of the biological body. When Elias touched the metal with the tongs, he felt the texture at the tip of the tongs, not in his hand. He was a cyborg of wood and iron in 1850. But the smithy was not merely a factory, it was the Google, the news feed, and the medical office of the village. While the iron heated, conversations happened. Politics, harvests, births. Elias, at the center of that stage of fire, was the keeper of the valley's secrets. They'd come to fix a hinge and stay 3 hours. In winter, my forge was the only warm place within 10 miles. I pulled teeth from grown men with my wire pliers because the doctor was drunk. I fixed children's toys. I forged wedding rings and coffin nails. From cradle to grave, Elias's metal held the life of the community together. He wielded immense social power. If the blacksmith didn't like you, your horse went lame and your harvest rotted in the field. There was a hierarchy of respect built on mutual dependence. They called Elias master. There was pride in that, an identity forged as hard as the steel he hammered. He believed the world would always need hands that knew how to read the fire. He believed his skill was eternal. But in Chicago, a man named Cyrus McCormick was about to change the color of the world. We heard the rumors. They said a machine was coming from the east, a reaper that did the work of 10 men. I laughed. I told them, machines break, and when they break, who's going to fix them? Me. I was wrong. The 1850s brought the collapse. It was not a war. It was a patent. McCormick's mechanical reaper, and soon after, industrial cast-iron plows. The difference was molecular. Elias's iron was wrought iron, fibrous, organic, alive. The factory iron was cast iron or early Bessemer steel, granulated, uniform, cheap. The first time I saw a factory plow piece, it was cold, not cold in temperature, cold in soul, all identical, thousands of them stacked in a warehouse in town. They cost half of what I charged just for the material. How do you fight that? You don't fight. Standardization killed customization. Elias made tools adapted to the height and strength of each farmer. The factory made tools for an average man who did not exist, but they were cheap, and economics always beats art. The end of the craft was not a bang. It was a slow silence. First, they stopped ordering plows. Then they stopped ordering new horseshoes. They bought the industrial ones and only asked Elias to nail them on. He stopped being a creator. He became an installer of parts he did not make. I felt like a musician who had been forbidden to play and could only turn the pages of the score for someone else. My hands itched. I looked at the fire, and it seemed impatient. But there was nothing to forge. By 1860, the great foundries already dominated. The rural blacksmith, the village's alchemist, had been demoted to a repair mechanic. The skill of reading temperature by color became obsolete. The new alloys came with instructions. The mystery had been dissolved by the owner's manual. What happens to a brain that had been trained for 30 years to process nuances of infrared when that skill is no longer worth anything? The craft taught patience, resilience, and the material truth of things. The replacement technology taught convenience and disposability. Elias watched the world shift from repairing to replacing. People changed, too. They became faster, less patient. Before, if the plow broke, the man would sit here, drink coffee, talk while I fixed it. Now, they arrive shouting they want the new part yesterday. The metal got hard, and the people got soft. Elias lived until 1904. He witnessed the arrival of the automobile. They say that in his final years, he no longer entered the smithy. He devoted himself to growing roses. It may seem like a strange shift, from steel to petals. But think about it. Roses, they have thorns. They need pruning. They respond to weather, to sun, to rain. It's the same conversation, only now I don't need to strike. I just need to watch. What remained was not the technique of swinging the hammer. It was the capacity for deep observation. Elias's trained eye applied the same rigorous reading he had used on glowing iron to the delicate petals of his flowers. He kept reading nature. He simply changed the dialect. When Elias died, his tools were sold for scrap. The iron he had shaped was melted down to become, perhaps, parts of a Ford Model T. The cycle closed. But there is something that McCormick's machine and the factories of Detroit could never replicate. The thermal signature of the human soul impressed upon the object. Every nail I made, I knew where it was going. I knew which plank it would hold. There was intention. Today, things are orphans. No one knows who made them, and whoever made them doesn't know where they're going. The world that existed inside those hands has disappeared. The ability to look at a heated rock and know instinctively the structure of its soul was lost forever. We gained tractors, skyscrapers, and airplanes. The cost was low. We only had to forget how to read the fire.